I wasn't planning on filming anything the day this happened. I walked into Dollar Tree for one specific thing, a birthday card, nothing more, and somehow walked out 40 minutes later with a cart full of home decor items I had absolutely no intention of buying when I arrived. It happens to almost everyone here at some point. You get pulled into an aisle you didn't plan to visit, and suddenly you're holding things you didn't know you needed. That evening, mostly out of curiosity, I sat down and looked up the closest equivalent to everything sitting on my kitchen counter from that trip, one item at a time, on real retailer websites. By the time I finished adding it all up, the number floored me. 12 completely ordinary items, picked up almost at random during an unplanned wander through the store, added up to $180 once I priced out real equivalents elsewhere. I paid $12 total. Today I'm walking you through every single item from that accidental haul in the exact order I grabbed them, so you can see exactly how an unplanned 40-minute detour turned into one of the best accidental discoveries I've made in this store. Stick around until the end, because the final total genuinely surprised even me, and I wasn't expecting to be making a video about any of this when the day started. I want to be upfront that this wasn't staged or planned in any way. I didn't walk in with a list or a plan to film a haul video, which is honestly why I think the numbers ended up hitting differently than a typical, carefully curated shopping trip would have. Every single item on this list is something I genuinely grabbed on instinct, in the order I actually encountered it walking through the store that day, not cherry-picked afterward to make a better video. The first item I grabbed, almost without thinking, was a Rattan-style wall mirror sitting on an end cap I walked past on my way to the card aisle. At $1, this small round mirror has a woven rattan frame that looks strikingly similar to the boho-style mirrors currently popular in home decor stores, where a comparable size and style typically sells for $20. The overall diameter is on the smaller side, closer to a decorative accent piece than a full functional mirror for checking your outfit, which actually matched the specific spot I ended up hanging it perfectly. I genuinely almost walked past it, but the frame detail caught my eye enough to stop and pick it up for a closer look, and once I had it in my hand, putting it back down didn't feel like an option anymore. The rattan weave felt sturdier than I expected, not the flimsy, easily bent material you sometimes find on the cheapest woven decor pieces. I hung it in my hallway later that evening, and it's genuinely one of my favorite small decor additions from the entire haul, especially once I found out what a similar piece would have cost me anywhere else. Standing back and looking at it on the wall a few hours later, I actually laughed a little thinking about how close I came to just walking straight past it toward the greeting cards without a second glance, moving straight to the next thing that caught my eye just a few steps further down the same aisle. Next, a soft wool blend throw scarf, folded neatly on a small display near the mirror. At $1, this scarf has a genuinely nice woven texture, warmer and heavier than I expected from the price. Closer in feel to scarves I've seen at boutique clothing stores, selling for $18 or more. The fringe along both ends was neatly finished too, rather than the loose, uneven threads you sometimes find on the cheapest accessories, a small detail that made the whole thing feel more finished than I expected. I actually wrapped it around my neck right there in the aisle just to test the texture against my skin, half expecting it to feel scratchy or thin, and it didn't. The color was a deep, versatile neutral that works with almost anything in my closet, which made the decision to grab it even easier once I'd already committed to picking up the mirror. I've worn it 3 separate times since that trip, and it's held up completely fine through normal wear, no pilling or stretching out of shape. For an item I picked up purely on impulse, it's turned into one of the more genuinely useful things from that entire unplanned haul. A coworker actually complimented it a few days later, asking where I'd gotten it, and the look on her face when I told her the price was honestly one of the more satisfying moments to come out of this whole accidental trip. The next item is one I grabbed specifically because my kitchen soap dispenser had just cracked that same week. Third, a ceramic soap dispenser with a simple, clean glaze finish. At $1, this replaced a dispenser I'd been meaning to swap out anyway, and the timing felt almost too convenient. Once I spotted it sitting on a shelf I wasn't even planning to walk down. A comparable ceramic dispenser at a home goods store runs around $16, mostly for a nearly identical simple, solid color glaze finish. The pump mechanism worked smoothly right out of the packaging, no sticking or uneven dispensing, which was genuinely my biggest worry grabbing a dispenser this cheap without being able to test the pump in store first. It's been sitting on my bathroom counter for weeks now with zero issues, and honestly looks nicer than the dispenser it replaced, which I'd actually paid more for originally at a different store. There's something almost funny about that specific detail, an accidental dollar find quietly outperforming a purchase I'd actually put thought and money into at some point in the past. Moving on to an item I grabbed 4 of, one for each placemat at my kitchen table. Fourth, a set of woven placemats, 4 to a pack, at $1 for the set, meaning about 25 cents per placemat. This genuinely stopped me for a second once I did that math in my head standing in the aisle. A comparable set of 4 woven placemats at a home textile store runs around $18, and I actually pulled out my phone right there to double-check that figure before adding them to my cart, half convinced I was misremembering typical placemat pricing. The weave felt sturdy enough to handle regular wiping down after meals without fraying at the edges, something I specifically checked by scratching a fingernail across the surface right there in the store. I've used them daily for the weeks since that trip, running them under water to rinse off spills more than once, and they've held their shape and color without any noticeable wear. For something that quietly upgrades a table setting for almost nothing, this was one of the better impulse grabs from that entire trip. I've since used them for 2 casual dinners with friends, and nobody at the table seemed to think twice about them looking anything less than a normal, intentional part of my kitchen setup. Next, an item I picked up specifically because a drawer handle at home had been loose for months. Fifth, a set of 4 brass-look drawer pulls. At $1, these small hardware pieces looked remarkably close to the brass cabinet hardware I'd been eyeing at a home improvement store for $14 for a comparable set. I actually pulled one out of the packaging right there to check the weight and finish, half expecting it to feel like flimsy painted plastic, and it had genuine metal weight to it instead. Installing them later that week took about 10 minutes total with a simple screwdriver, and they've held up without any dulling or loosening after regular daily use opening that specific drawer. It's a small, easy upgrade that quietly changed the whole look of that piece of furniture for almost nothing, purely because I happened to walk past the right aisle that day. I actually forgot which specific drawer had bothered me for so long once the new pulls were installed, since the entire piece of furniture suddenly looked cohesive and finished in a way it hadn't in months. Moving on to a small decorative piece that ended up on my kitchen windowsill. Sixth, a faux succulent arrangement in a small pot. At $1, this looked convincingly real from a normal viewing distance, with individually detailed leaves rather than one solid molded plastic shape, closer to the quality of arrangements I've seen at plant specialty stores selling for $12. The pot itself had a nice weighted base too, heavy enough that it doesn't tip over easily, a small detail that a lot of cheap faux plant arrangements skip entirely by using a hollow, lightweight base instead. I picked it up mostly because my actual succulents at home have a habit of dying no matter how little I water them, and a convincing fake felt like the easier long-term solution. It's been sitting on my kitchen windowsill for weeks now, and more than one guest has reached out to touch it specifically to check whether it was real, which felt like a pretty good sign of how convincing the detail actually is. My track record with actual living plants is genuinely embarrassing at this point, so having something this convincing that requires zero maintenance whatsoever has been a small but real relief. Next, a small glass item that caught my eye purely because of how the light hit it on the shelf. Seventh, a small glass bud vase. At $1, the glass had a slight decorative texture to it, catching light in a way that felt more elevated than a plain, flat glass vase, closer to what I've seen at boutique glassware shops for $10. I grabbed a single stem from my own garden that same afternoon just to see how it looked, and the vase held it upright without tipping, exactly what you'd want from a piece like this, despite the narrow base. It's been sitting on my dining table since, holding whatever flower happens to be around that week, a small, low-effort way to keep a bit of color on the table without buying a full arrangement. Even a single stem from my own yard, something I'd normally just leave in a plain drinking glass, suddenly looks intentional and put together sitting in this specific vase. Moving on to an item that solves a very specific problem I didn't realize I had until I saw it. Eighth, a leather-look journal with a simple, embossed cover design. At $1, the faux leather texture felt genuinely convincing in hand, not the shiny, obviously plastic feel some budget journals have, closer to journals I've seen at stationery boutiques for $15. I've been using it as a general notes and planning journal since that trip, and the paper quality has held up fine to regular pen use without significant bleed-through onto the next page. For anyone who likes journaling or note-taking but doesn't want to spend real money finding out if a new habit sticks, this removes almost the entire cost barrier to trying. I'd actually attempted journaling twice before with pricier notebooks that ended up abandoned after a few pages, so starting fresh with something that cost next to nothing took away a lot of the pressure I didn't realize I'd been putting on myself to make it worth the money. Next, an item I grabbed specifically because I needed something to serve snacks on that same weekend. Ninth, a wooden serving tray with simple raised edges. At $1, the wood had a smooth, finished surface, without obvious rough spots or splinters, closer in feel to serving trays I've seen at kitchen boutiques for $18. The handles cut into either end felt sturdy enough to comfortably grip and carry fully loaded without any flexing or creaking, something I specifically tested by loading it up with a stack of plates before actually needing it for guests. I used it that same weekend for a small gathering, loading it up with snacks and carrying it out to the living room without any wobbling or flexing under the weight. It's become a regular part of my weekend routine since, genuinely getting more use than I expected from something I grabbed almost as an afterthought while walking past that particular shelf. What started as a one-time solution for a single gathering has quietly turned into the tray I reach for almost every single weekend now, whether it's snacks, coffee, or just corralling clutter off the counter for a few minutes. Moving on to a small set that ended up protecting my coffee table from water rings. 10th, a set of woven basket coasters. At $1, these small woven coasters looked far more textured and interesting than a plain cork or rubber coaster, closer to the coastal or boho-style coasters sold at home decor stores for $11. I put a full glass of water on one immediately to test for any moisture seeping through, and my coffee table stayed completely dry underneath after leaving it there for a good 20 minutes. They've prevented at least 2 water rings since that trip that would have otherwise ended up on my coffee table, a small, genuinely functional purchase hiding behind what looked like a purely decorative item on the shelf. I hadn't even been specifically looking for coasters that day. My old set had simply gone missing at some point, and I'd been setting drinks directly on the wood out of laziness more than anything else, until these caught my eye. Next, a decorative glass jar that ended up holding cotton balls in my bathroom. 11th, a decorative glass jar with a cork lid. At $1, the glass had a nice weight and thickness to it, and the cork fit snugly without rattling loose, closer to apothecary-style jars I've seen at bath and body boutiques for $12. I filled it with cotton balls that same evening, and it's been sitting on my bathroom counter ever since, looking considerably more put together than the plastic bag they were living in before. It's a small change, but every time I glance at it now while brushing my teeth, it genuinely registers as a small upgrade rather than something I've stopped noticing entirely, which is more than I can say for a lot of things I've actually spent real money on. And finally, the last item, one I almost didn't grab because I nearly missed it tucked behind a taller display. 12th, a macrame plant hanger. At $1, the knotted rope work looked genuinely well made, even spacing and tight, consistent knots throughout, closer to the handmade-looking macrame hangers sold at plant shops or craft boutiques for $16. I almost walked right past it, partially hidden behind a taller shelf display, and only noticed it because a loose end of rope was hanging slightly into the aisle. I hung a small potted plant in it by my living room window that same day, and it's held the weight without stretching or loosening at the knots in the weeks since. Watching it sway slightly in the breeze from an open window a few days later, I genuinely couldn't picture that corner of my living room without it anymore, which is a strange thing to feel about something I almost didn't notice on the shelf at all. So here's the full tally, added up that same evening after laying every single item out on my kitchen counter. I want to walk through the math slowly, the same way I did sitting there that night, because watching the number climb item by item is honestly a big part of why this whole thing surprised me as much as it did. $20 for the mirror, $18 for the scarf, $16 for the soap dispenser, $18 for the placemats, $14 for the drawer pulls, $12 for the succulent, $10 for the vase, $14 for the journal, $18 for the tray, $10 for the coasters, $12 for the glass jar, and $18 for the plant hanger. Add all of that up, and the total comes to exactly $180 for the closest equivalents at other retailers. I paid $12 total for all 12 items that same afternoon, a completely unplanned haul that started with walking in for one single birthday card. That's 15 times more expensive elsewhere for items that, once I actually laid them all out side by side that evening, looked and functioned almost identically to what I'd priced out online. None of this was planned, none of it was researched ahead of time. It was genuinely just an accidental wander through a few aisles I wasn't intending to visit that day. If there's one thing this whole experience changed for me, it's how I think about a quick trip here for one specific item. I used to walk in, grab exactly what I came for, and leave as fast as possible. Now I give myself a few extra minutes to actually look around, because based on what happened that one afternoon, the most valuable finds here aren't always the ones you go in looking for. I've thought a lot since that day about why this particular haul worked out so well, and I don't think it was luck in the way it might sound. Every single item I ended up grabbing solved some small, specific problem I already had sitting in the back of my mind. A cracked soap dispenser, a loose drawer pull, missing coasters, even if I hadn't consciously been shopping for any of it that morning. I think that's actually the real lesson buried in this whole accidental trip. Walking through a store like this with even a loose mental list of small annoyances around your house, rather than a completely blank mind, seems to be exactly what turns a random wander into genuinely useful finds, instead of just impulse clutter you'll regret later. I certainly wasn't expecting a birthday card run to turn into anything worth filming, let alone anything worth adding up on paper afterward. But here we are, 12 accidental finds and $180 in savings later, all because I decided to take the slightly longer way to the greeting card aisle that particular afternoon.